12 men walked on the moon, but the mission Americans remember best never landed at all. Picture frost creeping across a capsule wall, breath fogging in air colder than a refrigerator, and 3 men stretching 2 days of power into 4. One flight came so close to becoming a funeral in space that NASA still calls it a successful failure. The fire on the pad. 3 men are strapped into a capsule that has never left the ground, running through a countdown rehearsal that is supposed to be routine. It is January 1967 on the launch pad at Cape Canaveral, and the cabin is filled with pure oxygen at higher pressure than the air outside. A single spark from exposed wiring is enough, so the fire spreads through the capsule in seconds, and the hatch, built to open inward against that pressure, will not budge in time. If you sat where they sat, you would have had less time to get out than it takes to read this sentence out loud. Gus Grissom, Ed White, and Roger Chaffee die without the rocket ever firing. 3 deaths inside a machine the size of a small car's interior, sealed tighter than a submarine hatch. NASA grounds the program for 20 months and rebuilds the capsule from the wiring up. A new hatch that swings open in seconds. A safer cabin atmosphere for launch. The men who never flew are the reason the ones who did came home. That is the quiet irony sitting under every Apollo mission that followed. Christmas at the moon. Long before anyone expected it, NASA gambled an entire spacecraft and 3 lives on a mission nobody had rehearsed. In December 1968, Apollo 8 becomes the first crewed flight to leave Earth's orbit entirely, aimed straight at the moon on a rocket that had only flown unmanned before. Frank Borman, Jim Lovell, and William Anders ride a translunar injection, a precise engine burn that breaks Earth's grip and slings the ship toward the moon, so there is no rescue if the math is wrong. If you floated where they floated, on the far side of the moon, out of radio contact with anyone on Earth, you would understand what it means to be more alone than any human being had ever been. Then Anders looks up from the window and photographs Earth rising over the lunar horizon, a blue marble the size of a thumbnail held at arm's length. The picture becomes the most reproduced photograph in history, outlasting in fame the landing that would come 7 months later. On Christmas Eve, the crew reads from Genesis live to roughly 1 in every 4 people on Earth. A mission built to prove hardware ends up changing how people see their own world. The dress rehearsal. Before any crew could land, the hardware had to prove it would not kill them first. Astronauts James McDivitt and Rusty Schweickart test the lunar module in Earth orbit through March 1969. The spidery 2-part lander built to detach from the main ship, descend, and reconnect. Then in May, Apollo 10 flies the entire mission profile at the moon itself, descending to within 9 miles of the surface, close enough to read the terrain a landing crew would face. Stafford and Cernan fly that low and are ordered, deliberately, not to land. The lunar module carrying too little fuel to make it back up if they tried. If you watch the surface rush past that close, 9 miles being roughly the distance most people commute to work, you would feel how thin the margin for the next flight really was. Every dock, every undock, every burn is rehearsed until it is boring, and boring is the goal. 2 crews complete every part of a moon landing except the actual landing. Mission planners realize the biggest risk left is no longer the hardware, it is trusting 2 men alone with the final decision of where to set it down. One small step. On the Sea of Tranquility, a stretch of lunar plain chosen because it was flat enough to forgive a bad landing, 3 men prepare to finish what a decade of engineering built toward. Neil Armstrong, Buzz Aldrin, and Michael Collins fly Apollo 11 to that plain in July 1969. The mission finally meant to touch down instead of rehearse. The lunar module's onboard computer overloads with alarms in the final minutes of descent, so Armstrong takes manual control and searches for open ground with roughly 25 seconds of fuel left before an abort would have been forced. If you stood beside that landing site, you would be looking at a guidance computer with less processing power than a modern kitchen calculator, flying 2 men to a surface no human hand had ever touched. Armstrong steps onto the regolith, the fine gray lunar soil, and speaks the line that outlives the mission itself. Aldrin joins him while Collins orbits alone overhead, farther from another human being than anyone in history up to that point. 50 years later, those first words are still the one thing most people can recite about the moon. Lightning strikes twice. At Kennedy Space Center in November 1969, a rocket climbs straight into a rainstorm nobody delayed the launch for. 36 seconds after liftoff, lightning strikes Apollo 12. Then it strikes again 16 seconds later, knocking out the command module's electrical systems and setting off a cascade of alarms while the spacecraft is still climbing.
Flight controller John Aaron remembers an obscure switch setting from a test months earlier and calls it out in seconds, so the crew resets the fuel cells before the mission is lost. If you gripped the controls in that cabin, watching every readout fail at once 18 miles above Florida, about 3 times higher than a commercial jet flies, you would understand how close a triumphant mission came to becoming a footnote.
Pete Conrad, Alan Bean, and Richard Gordon recover and go on to land with pinpoint precision, close enough to walk to the unmanned Surveyor 3 probe and cut pieces off it to bring home. NASA nearly aborts the moon landing over 2 lightning bolts that lasted less than a second combined. Instead, it becomes the most accurate landing of the entire program. Houston, we've had a problem. It is April 1970. 2 days into a flight everyone assumed would be routine, when an oxygen tank aboard Apollo 13 explodes some 200,000 miles from Earth, crippling the command module's power and air supply. Jim Lovell, Jack Swigert, and Fred Hayes crowd into the lunar module, a lander built to keep 2 men alive for 2 days, and now has to keep 3 men alive for 4. Temperatures inside drop close to freezing, so cold that frost forms on the walls, and the astronaut's breath is visible in the cabin light. If you had spent those 4 days folded into a space smaller than a minivan's interior, rationing water, and watching carbon dioxide levels climb toward dangerous, you would understand why engineers on the ground built an air filter out of a plastic bag, a manual cover, and duct tape, using only the parts the astronauts already had on board. Every calculation for re-entry has to be redone by hand, because the ship's computer was built for a different flight plan entirely. The crew splashes down safely on April 17th. NASA calls it a successful failure, and it becomes the story most Americans still remember first when they hear the word Apollo. Golf on the moon. 10 years after nearly dying on his own launch pad, one astronaut finally gets to walk further than anyone expected. Alan Shepard, the first American in space back in 1961, was grounded for most of the decade by an inner ear disorder before flying again on Apollo 14 in January 1971. He and Edgar Mitchell land in the Fra Mauro Highlands, the site originally meant for the aborted Apollo 13 mission, and haul a 2-wheeled cart to collect rock samples across rougher ground than any earlier crew had faced. If you walked that terrain in a suit weighing over 100 pounds on Earth, but a sixth of that on the moon, you would understand why Shepard, on his final steps, pulled out a makeshift 6-iron and hit 2 golf balls across the lunar surface. The gesture, filmed almost by accident, becomes one of the most replayed clips from the entire program. Those 2 golf balls are still sitting on the moon today, exactly where he left them. A man once grounded as too damaged to fly again, walked farther across another world than anyone before him. The rock that rewrote history. What the astronauts almost overlooked turned out to be older than anything they were looking for. In August 1971, Apollo 15 lands near Hadley Rill, a lunar canyon carved by ancient volcanic flow, and carries the first lunar rover, a battery-powered car that lets Dave Scott and Jim Irwin travel miles from the landing site instead of the few hundred yards earlier crews were limited to. On their second day, at a small crater called Spur, Scott and Irwin spot a whitish rock propped on a pedestal of dust, barely the size of a fist, small enough to fit in a coat pocket. If you knelt in that dust beside them, you would be looking at what geologists later confirmed as a nearly 4-billion-year-old fragment of the moon's original crust, older than almost any rock ever found on Earth. Scientists nickname it the Genesis Rock because it dates from close to the moon's formation itself. Before leaving, Scott quietly places a small memorial and a list of fallen astronauts and cosmonauts on the surface, unannounced until after the mission ends. The rover was built to cover distance. What it found instead was depth, one small stone that pushed the moon's own history back further than anyone expected. Speed record on the moon. Sent to study terrain nobody expected to be interesting, this crew found the opposite problem waiting for them. Apollo 16 lands in the Descartes Highlands in April 1972, an area geologists believed was shaped by ancient lunar volcanoes, hoping to bring back volcanic rock samples. John Young and Charles Duke instead find the terrain made almost entirely of impact debris, so the mission's core scientific assumption turns out to be wrong within hours of landing. If you climbed onto that rover beside Young, gripping handlebars while its wheels kicked up dust in the near vacuum, You would have been riding in the fastest vehicle any human had yet driven off the Earth, as Young pushes it past 10 miles an hour, setting a lunar speed record that lasts only 8 months, until Apollo 17 breaks it.
The astronauts adapt on the fly, gathering unexpected samples across 3 separate excursions instead of the volcanic material they trained for. Command Module pilot Ken Mattingly, once pulled from Apollo 13 for suspected measles he never caught, orbits alone above them, finally getting his own flight. The mission was planned around one theory. It disproved that theory and set a speed record instead. The last man on the moon. By the time this flight leaves the launch pad, everyone involved already knows it will be the final one.
In December 1972, Apollo 17 lands in the Taurus-Littrow Valley, carrying geologist Harrison Schmitt, the only trained scientist NASA ever sent to the moon, alongside Commander Eugene Cernan and pilot Ronald Evans. The crew spends over 3 days on the surface, longer than any mission before them, and drives the rover more than 20 miles across the valley floor, roughly the distance from one side of a mid-sized city to the other.
Before climbing the ladder for the last time, Cernan kneels in the dust and scratches his daughter's initials into the lunar soil, knowing no wind will ever come to erase them. If you watched him climb that ladder on the final night, you would be watching the last human footprints made on the moon for at least the next half-century. Before he leaves, Cernan says he expects people to return within years, not decades. Cernan believed the wait would be short. Budget cuts and shifting priorities turned his confident last words into the start of the longest pause in the history of exploration. If any single one of these missions had gone differently, no human being would have ever walked on the moon at all. Subscribe to see which mission from another world nearly ended in disaster next.